In this news roundup of a week for the 24th of June 2022, Prime Minister Boris Johnson teeters on the brink once again after the worst by-election results in living memory. The EU confirms Ukraine as a candidate for membership even as the EU's unity is falling apart. China extends its grip on internet censorship, but it's not the only one. And in this week's Short Thought, I draw lessons from an example of unintended consequences from worthy actions. My name is Mallen Baker, this is the Mallen Baker Show. A couple of weeks ago I mentioned that the real plotters who would like to see UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson ousted from within his own party, they would have regretted the timing of a no confidence motion that came against him a few weeks ago because it came at the wrong time. They calculated it had more chances of being successful if it had been delayed to just after the pending parliamentary by-elections. Well, those by-elections happened yesterday, and you'd have to say they rather back that up. Particularly the one that was the worst Conservative loss ever in what was one of the safest Conservative seats in Tiverton and Honiton with a 24,000 majority. But even that majority was overturned after a swing of almost 30% from Tories to Liberal Democrats. Now, by-elections are not measures of what will actually happen in a general election, but the size of a swing, the ferocity of feeling amongst the voters there, certainly would have rattled a lot more Tory MP cages had they experienced that before the confidence vote. The Conservative Party chairman, Oliver Dowden, speedily resigned with a resignation letter that somehow failed to mention his ongoing support for the Prime Minister. And that left Boris Johnson in Rwanda of all places, where he'd made it clear, as everyone expected, he would aim to simply carry on regardless. The Prime Minister said he would listen to voters, but he would keep going. Second half of that sentence rather putting a lie to the first half. The question was whether there would be an increasing wave of ministerial resignations that might gain an unstoppable momentum over the next couple of days, or whether the damage would be contained where it is. The last time a government lost two by-elections on the same night was under John Major's government. He was swept out of power in the next election with a huge swing that gave Tony Blair's first government its sizable working majority. Now that said, Blair and the senior people around him looked increasingly like a government in waiting by that point. Not entirely something that anyone has recently accused Keir Starmer's Labour Party of. So history may or may not neatly repeat itself. It all rather depends on what's going to happen in the next year or so. Now, compared to Johnson's difficult patch, you might think that the US President Joe Biden has had it easy this week, because all that happened to Biden is that he fell off his bike. Sadly for him, for all that it was a matter of little importance in any real sense, it was one of those moments that attains greater significance in the public mind because it resonated so completely with how they are already negatively perceiving him. Brutally unfair as it may be, it will probably be one of the enduring images that remains after his presidency has ended. More important in the US has continued to be the discussion around guns, and that hit two rather different milestones this week. First, the cross-party bill that we discussed over the last couple of weeks passed its biggest hurdle in the Senate, being passed in a vote that saw the support of 15 Republicans, and that in spite of the fact of a certain amount of backlash against Republican supporters in the last week. It should now pass relatively easily through the House. That news was rather cut across by the momentous ruling this week by the Supreme Court that some states' restrictions on guns that do exist are held to be unconstitutional. And the upshot of this is that states are not able to set additional requirements before citizens can get a concealed carry gun permit. This arose from a case challenging the state of New York, which has a law that in order to be able to carry a gun outside the home, you have to be able to prove that you have, quote, proper cause for doing so, constituting, quote, a special need for self-protection distinguishable from that of the general community. The court held that this was unconstitutional as it prevented law-abiding citizens with ordinary self-defence needs from exercising their Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms in public for self-defence. And it said this: the exercise of other constitutional rights does not require individuals to demonstrate to government officers some special need. The Second Amendment right to carry arms in public for self-defence is no different. And that basically means that Americans across the United States now have the right to carry their guns in public. At least they will when the various laws have been repealed to be compliant. Reactions were exactly as you would expect. So the National Shooting Sports Foundation celebrated that the burden is on the government to justify restrictions, not on the individual to justify to the government a need to exercise their rights. While the gun control group Brady said, in a stroke of the pen, the Supreme Court today has invented a supposed right to carry virtually anywhere loaded guns to potentially shoot and kill other people. And speaking of people shooting and killing people, one of the things Vladimir Putin was counting on when he invaded Ukraine was that the West generally, and Europe specifically, would continue to be weak and divided, which after all had been the observable recent trend. Everyone's bigged up about how huge a miscalculation that was, but the question was always on the longer game, because quite strong possibility they would start united. Would that really last once the pressure was on? This week we saw a European summit and it was full of fine words and the headline-grabbing offer to Ukraine of candidate status to join the European Union, but behind the scenes it was all falling apart. Germany was one of the power centres that was saying the EU needed to reform its treaties and its voting rules in areas such as foreign policy before it could admit new member countries. In particular, countries like Ukraine and Moldova, and he almost certainly had several existing members in mind as well, should not be able to block key decisions. German Chancellor Scholz said such change could happen quickly, because obviously that's what the EU is famous for. France quickly disabused him of that notion by raising objections to any idea that it might have to cede its own power to veto proposals in the area of foreign policy. So Ukraine is a candidate, but it might not even exist anymore as a country by the time that is likely to turn into anything resembling a reality. A fact that was protested by another key group, the other states that already have candidate status for whom the process has been progressing about as fast as a drugged tortoise on a bad day. The leaders of these 6 Balkan countries, Albania, Bosnia, Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia and Serbia, they expressed, some said disillusion, others described it as fury, that nothing has happened for them whatsoever almost 2 decades after being established as candidates. Add to that the ongoing disagreements about how to deal with Putin, with France's President Macron continuing to phone him regularly and to argue that he must be given a way out where he's not seen to lose face. Well, not everyone agrees. Estonia's Prime Minister riposted, Putin can save face by going back to Russia, adding, I don't see any point in really talking to him if we want to get the message through that he's isolated. Poland's president asked if anyone worried about saving Hitler's face. But it's on the field of energy that the fault lines really open up, a fact that Putin tested last week with a reduction in the gas supply, presumably to see what impact that would have. And the answer is it had a significant impact. The surge in energy prices has done pretty well for Putin, for all that the sanctions have genuinely been hurting the Russian economy in various ways. Germany paid Russia 20 billion euros in the first 4 months of the year, thank you very much, and for the time being they have no choice. They had worked their way into a trap of their own making, and therefore the logic of sanctions was always going to come back to slap Europe in the face, while significantly weakening its impact on Russia. And the high prices have meant that Russia has found alternative buyers. So Russia is now China's top oil supplier, taking that crown from Saudi Arabia. India has increased its consumption of Russian oil by 25 times. Russia's total income from selling energy this year is likely to be 35% up on last year, around $320 billion worth. If Russia was continuing to lose on the battlefield, maybe that wouldn't be such an issue, but they're not. And that suggests the conflict will drag on for a longer period of time. Markus Kreber, the chief executive of energy giant RWE, told the Financial Times that energy issues would stress European solidarity to breaking point come next autumn and winter. For instance, countries such as Germany and the Netherlands, which are importing gas via carrier ships, will be accused of hoarding the fuel by countries if they are not treated equally across member states. It is better to discuss emergency proceedings when you still have time and not when the house is on fire, he said. The editor of The Spectator, Fraser Nelson, summarised the position like this. France and Germany talk about realpolitik, the need to be firm with Russia, but to deal with it longer term. To offer EU membership, just not anytime soon. To offer support to Ukraine, but not to go so far as to actually save it. This would all conform to Putin's original bet that a debt-addled, exhausted West cannot defend democracy anymore and has no stomach for a protracted fight. It seems unlikely that President Biden's visit to Europe next week, where he reportedly hopes to shore up the alliance, will do much to sort out the inbuilt weaknesses. Indeed, in many ways, the recent events have highlighted to the West that it's perhaps not as well placed as it thought, at least for modern warfare. The UK's Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has said that it had become obvious that the West would struggle to mount a long-term war because it has failed to stockpile enough ammunition. He said that Europe, Britain and the United States have all hollowed out their forces so that they looked good at the front, but they don't have sufficient supply lines. The war in Ukraine had underlined just how many shells and bullets are used during an intense fighting period. Both Russia and Ukraine are believed to be running out of ammunition now, so the question remains who learns the lesson most and therefore gains an advantage in the future. Bearing in mind, by the way, China has not been depleting its ammunition stocks in the last few months. And speaking of China, this has also been a big week for censorship and digital surveillance. China is already one of the most censored and regulated internet spaces in the world. Well, this week we learned that the authorities are still closing those final loopholes that might still remain. So next in line is comment sections on other content, which attract many millions of posts every day and can unfold into real-time conversations that can occasionally stray into political topics. Under the new rules, only those that have registered their real identity to their account will be able to add comments at all, and any that post comments on forbidden topics, they will be subject to a number of legal sanctions. The need for a standalone mechanism with its own regulation is reportedly simply because the vast number of comments that get made every day makes it impossible for the censors to keep on top of them with the standard tools. Eric Liu, a former censor for Weibo, now at the China Digital Times, told the MIT Technology Review, "One thing everyone in the censorship industry knows is that nobody pays attention to the replies and bullet chats. They are moderated carelessly with minimum effort." That, it seems, is soon to change, and possibly because there have been some embarrassing incidents for the government lately where comments under government's own Weibo accounts diverted into commentary about the government's lies. It's not obvious the new measures can practically be enforced, specifically one that makes the social media platforms themselves responsible for reviewing comments before they are published. That would involve reading billions of messages a day, and would force the platforms to hire many more people in order to do so. Ironically, Elon Musk's Tesla is now having to fight right now to persuade China that its cars are not spying on them and can be allowed free rein on Chinese roads. The cars have been banned from some places where officials are meeting for important discussions or summits, since the government's worried that the car's various cameras and sensors could be used for spying on them, picking up conversations, relaying them to the American security services. Elon Musk has made repeated personal assurances the cars are not used this way, but apparently to no avail. And you can't say they might not be right to be concerned, given the revelations leaked by Edward Snowden nearly a decade ago. We learned from him that the NSA has had a program of intercepting servers and other network hardware before export. Having taken temporary possession of the equipment, they would install their own additional equipment and malware into the software before then sending them on to their unsuspecting buyer, all without the knowledge of the manufacturer Cisco. The Chinese might conclude that even if Musk believes what he's saying, there is no guarantee the government hasn't found ways to utilise the cars without him even knowing about it. Of course, it's no worse, nor indeed much different from what the West accused China of doing via Huawei. All the world secret services are showing that they will use whatever technology they have to hand to invade the privacy of the rest of the world. And one of the most successful to date, other than the NSA in America, has been the Israeli NSO group, which makes the now notorious Pegasus spyware. Pegasus is able to infect your smartphone without touching it, without anyone having to click on an attachment in an email or anything similar. Once installed, it can review anything and everything: voice calls, emails, texts, pictures, video. Well, NSO Group were finally pulled in to speak to the European Parliament's committee that is looking into the use of spyware in Europe. By all accounts, it was something of a tense session, because some of those present had actually been targeted by the software on their own phones over recent years. The company told the MEPs that Pegasus has been used in at least 5 EU countries, and they terminated the contract with at least one EU government for wrongful use. The company maintains it only sells the software to legitimate governments and only for state security business, not for other things it would be exceptionally useful for, like spying on and collecting dirt on political opponents, or for industrial espionage and the like. Still, the dynamics are about to change, since the company is in the process of being taken over almost certainly by an American defence contractor, L3Harris Tech, although that detail isn't finally concluded yet. The takeover brings it home that this is slightly different. Governments have always weaponised whatever technology they have to hand, but NSO Group was the first example of that being carried out to order by a private company, with governments as customers, a company that could get taken over. That dynamic will change again if it becomes absorbed into the American defence agencies, because it will end up being part of the NSA arsenal. Tech consultant Asim Prakash at the Centre for Innovating the Future told the Tech Monitor website, "Once it is militarised, countries that are aligned with the US will have probably very little problem with it. And countries that are not aligned will have to figure things out." By figuring out, I presume he means we'll have to guess what they can do to keep the Americans out of the mobile phone of their president or prime minister. The big question might be, would they bug the new Australian prime minister's phone? Generally, the US, at least according to the Snowden revelations, did not use hackers to spy on the other members of the Five Eyes alliance, namely Britain, Canada, New Zealand and Australia. But Australia's new Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has said that he is working behind the scenes to try to prevent Julian Assange from being extradited from Britain to the United States. And that's the sort of thing that attracts the Americans' interest. Assange, the co-founder of WikiLeaks, learned at the end of last week that the UK Home Secretary, Priti Patel, had approved for his extradition. The presumption is that if he ends up in the US courts, he will go to prison, probably for the rest of his life, almost certainly at a high-security prison, maybe even the same one that Jeffrey Epstein ended up at, if you know what I'm saying. Albanese said that while the government wouldn't directly intervene or campaign in public, nevertheless, he was using his influence. Before the election, he was on the record as saying this: "I do not see what purpose is served by the ongoing pursuit of Mr. Assange. He is an Australian citizen as well, and with that should come an obligation on the Australian government to ensure that he receives appropriate support." Assange still has further appeals to exhaust before an extradition would actually take place, so we remain watching with interest. There are some people who think that solving problems is easy, and therefore they will condemn older generations for having left any problems for them to have to deal with themselves. But the challenge with problems that exist at large scale is that you look for solutions to push to large scale, and it's at that scale that you start to discover unintended consequences. So let me give you an example. In 2004, C.K. Prahalad published a highly influential book, The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid. His argument was that in order to tackle extreme poverty, the private sector needed to be energetic and creative in working out how to better serve the poor as customers. If you could do that, you could feed an upward spiral of development while also making their lives better. So one of his big case studies was that of Unilever, which worked to produce its soaps, its detergents and its shampoos into individual small sachet portions that the poorest people could afford. There was a whole lot of detail around it and why it was good and what you need to do to make it work, about how you could build a distribution network in the absence of sophisticated logistical infrastructure. But the key point was finding ways to reduce the price point to the minimum. Use individual portioning, and you could still make a healthy profit by selling those products at scale to people who nevertheless live on less than $2 a day. Hence the bottom of the pyramid. There was a fortune to be made by selling to people at the bottom, the poorest people. You just had to have innovation and drive to realise it. Unilever was big into this, and they pushed that model to scale ever since. Now makes up about 10% of their global sales, and many have quoted them as a case study. Fast forward to this week, and I noted that the chief executive at Unilever publicly called those individual portion sachets evil. Alan Jope made this statement a couple of years ago on the grounds that, pushed to scale over all those years, those sachets have fed growing mountains of plastic waste. And yet, while the chief executive was taking that stance, it turned out that his company's subsidiary in India had been lobbying against moves to ban exactly those sachets. Hence, inevitably, you got Greenpeace accusing Unilever of, quote, appalling hypocrisy. Which is easy for them to do because they only care about one side in this difficult trade-off. Unilever have said that they are exploring options for different reusable and refillable packaging systems that would work for their low-income customers, because they don't want to give up on those people. Because as always, when you lurch towards the obvious and easy answers, which usually involves banning something, you create problems elsewhere. The point is this: when Prahalad came out with his book, it was feted and celebrated. It became hugely influential, muted somewhat over time when it turned out the challenge he was posing was actually a really difficult one to solve. He was criticised a couple of years in from one academic, Anil Kanani, who argued that he'd overstated the opportunity and that most of the examples he gave were actually involving consumers who didn't meet the less than $2 a day criteria. But nobody that I recall pinpointed that likely outcome in terms of plastic waste. It hadn't yet become an issue in the mainstream in the way that it is today. The solutions of today may turn out to be important ways forward that we have to deal with. Whether they are or not, they are also likely to turn into tomorrow's problems. And my prediction is that when they do, we'll look surprised and ask, how could we ever have known? There comes a point when your species continues to fail to predict the predictable, refuses to learn the lessons from history. You have to conclude that these patterns are going to continue, because how can they not when that is how we collectively behave? Well, if we're incapable of doing that as a society, no reason why you have to be like that personally in your own life. We might as well learn these lessons. Actions have consequences. Sometimes they're the right thing to do anyway. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be able to plan for those consequences as best you can. Try to prevent them from becoming tomorrow's problems. All right. Next week will give me something of a challenge with this news roundup, since at least some of the time when I'm usually most busy preparing it is going to be disrupted by an external thing. I mention it now in case you should notice next week that the news roundup turns out to be a bit shorter or lacking visuals. That might happen this week because I'm a little bit behind time anyway. One way or another, it will be made. And that's a commitment I make, especially with reference to the good people who support this channel on Patreon. I simply could not spend the time that I do making these videos without that support. And so I will do my best to always get these videos out, because it makes a huge difference knowing that in spite of all the nonsense that gets thrown about in the discussion forums and elsewhere that might make you think, why do you bother? There's a group of people there who solidly support what you're trying to do, willing me to succeed. And so my thanks go to those people. If you would like to add your support for the independent, fact-focused and non-ideological content that I aim to produce here, please head on over to patreon.com/Mallen Baker. Believe me, it is always appreciated. Either way, have a great week. My name's Mallen Baker. This is the Mallen Baker Show. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, please share with anyone else you think would also enjoy it. Word of mouth is really important to us. And if you've not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? As the saying goes, that subscribe button won't smash itself.